Welcome to the BeWell program. I'm Dr. Ted Bender, clinical psychologist and CEO of the BeWell Network. My goal in this program is to educate the public about mental health awareness. Today we have a very special program. We actually have the honor of having the president and CEO of the D.A.R.E program, Frank Pegueros. Frank, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're all familiar with D.A.R.E growing up. I certainly went through the D.A.R.E program when I was in middle school. My son just graduated from the D.A.R.E program in his school, and he proudly wore his T-shirt every Friday, and then proudly he put the completion of certificate up on his wall. So greatly appreciative to you and your entire organization for what you're doing across this country. God knows we need every tool in the toolbox to fight the growing epidemic of drug overdose death and the fentanyl uprise in America.
Thank you very much.
So this program is targeted to help educate kids about drugs and their horrible effects on the bodies, lifestyle, and the future. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to become president and CEO of D.A.R.E?
Yes, so in a prior life, I served with the Los Angeles Police Department for 25 years. The year after D.A.R.E was introduced, in 1994, I became acquainted with D.A.R.E because I was promoted into a position that was responsible partially for medical support for the program. The program was implemented without funding from the city, and it was necessary to develop the funds to support the program until the budget caught up with it.
Yeah.
Through my promotions with the department, I kept coming back to D.A.R.E. My final assignment was the commanding officer of LAPD's D.A.R.E division. And when I retired, I went to work for D.A.R.E America, and in 2012 was appointed the president and CEO.
That's excellent. Can you describe the mission of D.A.R.E, how the mission is now, how it's changed over time, and what the program really is designed to do?
So the program has changed significantly. In your introduction, you mentioned a substance abuse prevention education program, and that's what it was initially developed as. But we've evolved to a program that teaches decision-making relative to alcohol, tobacco, marijuana. The mission is to provide students the skills necessary to lead safe and drug-free lives.
In your opinion, what role do the schools and community-based organizations play in all of this?
They're essential components of any comprehensive substance abuse prevention education program that a community might implement. Schools, law enforcement organizations, community organizations can be found in any and all communities across the United States. They're a common denominator in communities. There are organizations that the public can rely upon, can get involved in, and provide a great service to the community.
I remember in graduate school, there was actually a lot of research on the kind of the early endeavors of D.A.R.E and the kind of like later in life outcomes, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And if I recall correctly, a lot of the outcome measurements were pretty benign or ineffective. I know that that's changed a lot over time. So I was curious, and you mentioned kind of how it's evolved. I was curious how you guys measure outcomes now, and if we've seen changes or improvements in outcomes for students maybe who've gone through the program who didn't, or however you guys are measuring those outcomes. I was really curious about the data.
Yes, so I measure the results in three ways. There's my personal observations, anecdotal observations, intuitive feelings, but there's also pre-post tests that show results for short-term knowledge gain and attitudinal change.
Yeah.
But there's also the rigorous longitudinal scientific investigations that we participated in. There's changes and knowledge gain, but actual behavior modifications. You mentioned some of the older studies. and both D.A.R.E. and the research community have evolved. We've had several researchers that were involved in research involving D.A.R.E. in the late 80s, early 90s, to say that their field of work has evolved so that they're looking for things different than what they were looking for at that period of
Yeah.
time. Probably the author of one of the many of the studies were critical of D.A.R.E. Dr. Dick Clayton is now the chair of our scientific advisory board. And he's totally committed to the program. He believes, having gone through the training as a participant, had he gone through the training before becoming a professor, he would have been a better teacher.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I appreciate you commenting on that. Frank, I wonder, do you see a rise in drug use in youth currently, particularly in group homes, low income areas, or from troubled homes, or any other area of the country that you're observing?
Certainly, we've all seen the reports of a rise in abuse of opioids, particularly those that are laced with fentanyl, because of the increased mortality rate. But in minority communities, lower income communities, there's always been a history of increased substance use. I don't think there's been any studies explaining why, but it could be the targeting of advertising. When I speak of drugs, I include alcohol and tobacco. And a lot of people have just come to accept that they're not dangerous substances. But low-income communities have a higher incidence of retail dealers that sell alcohol. There's advertising targeted for in-need communities. Your last point relative to children that are in high-risk homes, that really concerns me. They're higher risk for substance abuse than a lot of other youth. Given they've been isolated in homes during the pandemic experience, I don't know that we'll know for a long time what has happened to those children over the last 2 or 3 years.
I completely agree with you on that. Yeah,
I'm afraid that the results are not going to be good.
As a scientist and researcher myself, I agree with you completely. I don't think we've been we're kind of just now seeing some of those outcome studies of how the pandemic has affected our youth. There's a study that just came out recently talking about teenage girls and all of the horrific stressors that they're dealing with now, rise in suicide rates, desire for suicide, all kinds of trauma. And I think those are just the beginning of the outcome studies that we're seeing from the effects of the pandemic. So yeah, I agree with you completely on that. I think it's going to be at least 5-10 years before we really know the true impact of all this.
Yeah, a lot of mental health services, resources, a lot of observations of abuse take place in the school.
Yeah.
And that's for a lot of students in high risk environments. That's where they look for their help.
You know what? Another thing I think about a lot, and with our kids especially, back in when I was a kid and growing up, people experimented with drugs and alcohol. Pretty typical, common thing to happen. But it was, dipping into dad's liquor cabinet, or or getting some marijuana or something like that. These days, experimenting could lead to taking one wrong pill, and that's it, and it's over. And I've heard countless kind of horror stories of that exact example. The 14, 15-year-old kid who's the quarterback of the team, and he's a rising star, and he's got good grades, and he's stayed out of trouble, and one night him and his friends decide to take some oxy that they got off the street or some dealer, which was laced with fentanyl, and it's over. Ball game. The dangers and the risks have just increased so much, and that's why, again, I'm so appreciative of the work that you guys are doing. I have a 11-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they're going through your program right now. And as a substance use disorder specialist, I talk to them very openly about the dangers of this stuff. But you know, and I know, we can talk to them until they're blue in the face. They're going to have to make decisions at some point, and arming them with the knowledge of through these types of programs and parental involvement, like you mentioned, and the school involvement, I think is really our best chance to
Yeah,
prevent catastrophe.
yeah, absolutely. At this point, particularly with the opioids that are laced with fentanyl, it's not a scare tactic that one pill can kill.
Yeah,
And now they're, particularly on the East Coast, and it's working its way west. We're getting opioids that are laced with fentanyl and xylene. And xylene, not being an opioid, is not responsive to Narcan.
I know.
So it's another wave of potential fatal experimentation turned into a reality.
Exactly. And, you know, with the rise in the use of Narcan, which has undoubtedly saved countless lives, I've brought people back from a Narcan overdose myself personally. I know what it's like, and it's terrifying going through that. Now, the last thing we need is some new mixture or cocktail that's resistant to the only opioid antidote overdose antidote. It just feels like we're, you know, Sisyphus pushing a rock up a hill constantly fighting this battle.
Yeah, at times it feels that, but on the other hand, those positive experiences, such as you described, bringing somebody back,
Yeah,
that's when you get to see the benefit of what you're doing.
that's why we keep fighting.
It is.
Frank, what are some of the biggest challenges that Dare America faces in fulfilling its mission? How does the organization address those challenges? How do you guys pivot, and what are some of the day-to-day difficulties?
The largest difficulty, the most significant difficulty, is convincing decision makers that their approach to substance abuse prevention needs to be comprehensive.
Yeah,
You just can't offer a program in elementary school. It needs to there needs to be a follow-up intervention. Students need to be supported at every turn.
yeah,
If they're at the Y, if they're at a youth meeting at school, if they're in the mall, they need to know that the entire community is supportive of their being healthy and safe.
mm,
So and I know it's a cost, but I don't look at it as it's an investment. If you don't invest now, the community is going to pay later.
I like how you said that. They need to know that their community is supporting them. I think that's so important, and a great quote. You know, if some kids who are lucky enough to have supportive parents who are teaching them good guidelines and raising them right, that's great. You know, not every kid has that. A lot of kids are in really kind of situations where they're more likely to succumb to the urges of drugs and alcohol through peer pressure or friends they shouldn't be hanging out with. But we take it a step further and show community support in all those different areas through teachers and schools, and that just gives them a better chance to make it through.
Sometimes there's a disconnect between children and parents. Uh, the children want involvement of the parents,
Yeah,
uh, but their outward behaviors indicate to the parents that their input may not be welcome.
yeah,
So it's really sitting down and communicating, parents listening.
agreed. And you know, I draw on my own limited experience with my own kids. Again, they're still young, so they're at the oh yeah, drugs are horrible, I would never touch it phase. You know, when they're young, that when they're 8, 10, 11 years old, you know, it's pretty much every kid's like, no, of course I wouldn't do that. It's when they get into their
Yeah,
teens and they start hanging out with, you know, the wrong crowd where you really start to become concerned as a parent, and a community and as a community, because again, it's just not the same as it was in the 90s or the 80s or the 70s. We're in a whole different playing field now.
yeah. We try to facilitate conversations between students and their parents or adult caregivers.
Mm,
Every other lesson in our curriculum at elementary school involves a take-home activity
yeah,
where the adult can say, "This is an awkward decision, but D.A.R.E. wants us to talk about this." And at that point, we can talk about expectations, behaviors.
Exactly.
And, and, and if somebody feels awkward, they can blame it on D.A.R.E. I'm willing to take that blame.
Well, it's smart. You know, we in a substance use treatment facility such as BeWell, and other places that I've worked, we agree with you completely. I mean, the work with the family is just as important as the work with the client that we're dealing with, and we try to involve
Yeah.
them at every step. And you know, you got situations where they're very open to that. You have situations where they're not so open to that, saying, "I'm not the one with the problem. Why do I need to be in therapy or work?" And then you have the other set who may either be using themselves or just completely enabling that family member. So no matter what scenario they're in, the family involvement I think is just as critical as anything in preventing drug use, which is what I love about D.A.R.E. You guys are focused on early prevention. Not enough is being talked about that. Not enough resources are being put towards that. We're always in this reactive state as a substance use kind of treatment across America. We're reacting all the time. But D.A.R.E. is all about preventing the problem in the first place, which is what I love. Which was,
I, I,
yeah,
I totally believe and support in treatment, rehabilitation.
yeah,
But if we can prevent somebody from getting to that point, we're ahead of the game.
agreed. Which leads me to my next question, and I think it's just amazing how you guys collaborate with law enforcement. So, can you tell us a little bit about how D.A.R.E. collaborates with law enforcement agencies and other stakeholders to prevent substance use among youth?
Yeah, it's D.A.R.E. is a small organization. We have about 15 people on staff, but we have a large footprint. We have a cooperative agreement with law enforcement agencies across the United States, several thousand law enforcement agencies, and 24 foreign nations are delivering the program.
Wow.
We require the officers to abide by a code of conduct. If they are straying from the curriculum, we will relieve them of the privilege of delivering the curriculum.
Yeah.
If they exhibit bad role model behavior, we will rescind their certification to deliver the program. We require the two partners, the police department and the school, to actually enter into a memorandum of understanding where each gives a valuable asset. The law enforcement agency, their personnel to teach the program. The school gives up their treasure and classroom time for the officer to deliver the program. So it's an amazing collaboration, and we've had some very unique individual collaborations. I had one region, the southeast coal counties of Montana, where the way the communities are laid out, a county sheriff D.A.R.E. officer could be 100 miles from a school, but another agency could be 2 miles away. So we had 9 sheriffs swear in deputies, all the concerned agencies, and depending on what day it was, they had a different uniform that they wore and went into that school.
And you do all that with 15 employees?
Amazing.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Well, that's amazing. I can't believe that you guys have been able to accomplish as much as you have with that few people. That's really incredible. But yeah, like you said, the strategic partnerships are really the meat and potatoes of it all. The schools and the local law enforcement. How do you think D.A.R.E. addresses issues related to equity and access in this program, particularly for underserved communities?
So it's our curriculum is universal in nature.
Gotcha.
It's not a specific conditional curriculum. It's designed for any community. The relationship between the school, parents, and the students and the D.A.R.E. officer is very unique. Um, Everybody will recall the unrest that took place in Ferguson, Missouri years ago, where it was reported there was huge distrust between the community and the law enforcement community. But at the same time, it wasn't reported. The oldest elementary school in Missouri was celebrating a milestone anniversary during all that unrest. And the honored guest of the celebration was their D.A.R.E. officer,
Hmm.
a white D.A.R.E. officer in a minority school, where it was being reported that nobody in the community trusted the police. The relationship between the D.A.R.E. instructor and the parents is unique. It may be the only time that many adults have had a opportunity for a positive interaction with somebody from the law enforcement community.
That's interesting. The piece you just mentioned. So it also not only are working with underserved populations and teaching kids and helping to prevent later in life substance abuse problems, but you're also bridging that gap with what can be a very contentious relationship with people living in that area and law enforcement. So it kind of works as a it's a double positive there. That's something I had never thought of.
Yeah, yeah. Sheriff Furlong in Carson City, Nevada, was telling me of an incident recently. He had responded to an incident in a field that was being handled by his deputies. It involved gang members, and he saw a gang member he recognized as one of the leaders, community leaders, approaching him, and he kind of braced himself for a verbal altercation. But instead, the gang member extended his hand and thanked him for having D.A.R.E. in his community, because his daughter was in a D.A.R.E. class, and he didn't want his daughter to experience what he had experienced.
That's staggering, actually, if you think about it. So you had a gang member thanking the officer for educating his daughter.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's if you ask adults, even those that are proponents of legalization, if you ask them if they would want their younger sibling or their children to become involved in use, they'll tell you no.
Yeah. That's an amazing story. And I hadn't thought about D.A.R.E. in that way, kind of coming into this, about that kind of how it can kind of bring communities together, not only just focused on prevention. So that's amazing and such necessary work, and such a politically divided time across our country. We could use as much of that as possible.
Yeah.
I wonder how I know your program has evolved over the decades significantly. You touched on that earlier, and now all this new stuff keeps coming out, especially when it's with our young adults and teens. We have things like vaping, right? So cigarette smoking is down across the nation, not just with kids. Across the nation, it's down significantly. But what do we have an uprise in is vaping, right? Originally
Yes.
kind of put out there as the safer cigarette, but as more and more we learn, I don't think there's anything safe about it. So how do you guys adapt to that? Like vaping, synthetic drugs, all this new stuff that's kind of coming out. Do you guys how do you deal with that? How do you handle that?
So the original D.A.R.E. curriculum was 17 lessons. It was designed by educators, and to them that was the typical number of weeks available during a traditional school semester.
Right.
And as issues arose, such as you just mentioned, in order to introduce it to the curriculum, you would have to take something out and insert a new lesson.
Yeah. Okay.
And over time, the thread between and amongst lessons was lost. When we adopted the Keeping It Real curriculum, which is 10 lessons long, we decided how we would address emerging issues through a system of what we call enhancement lessons. So we will develop a lesson that deals with teen mental health, as we did in cooperation with the foundation, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And that can be added to the core curriculum to become lesson number 11. Or the Organization for Social Media Safety, social media safety. So the student traverses a curriculum without knowing that they've gone from the core curriculum to an enhancement lesson. It's all designed in the same fashion. There's no transition. And that enables us to not alter the core curriculum, but deal with emerging issues.
Got you. Did you say you guys touch on mental health as well?
Yes. Yeah, there's a strong connection between substance experimentation, abuse, and teen mental health.
Absolutely.
We're not a suicide prevention program.
Good.
Our lessons are designed to educate students about the signs that they may need help, to identify for them the resources that are available to them. Within the first week of implementing the enhancement lessons on the, the course is called More Than Bad. We had one incident in New Hampshire where a student, after sitting through the class, came to the officer and told the officer that she had anticipated and planned on committing suicide later that day. I don't know that we prevented the suicide, but at least we did get that student some resources to help.
Wow, that's a really powerful story. I spent years as a suicide researcher, not only in graduate school, but I worked for the Department of Defense for a while doing suicide research on the military. And I can tell you, if someone's at the point where they have a date and time and a plan to enact or attempt to die by suicide, that's about as severe as it gets. So I would venture to say that you guys probably did save her life that day. That's an incredible
Oh,
success
absolutely.
story. And the other thing too is just teaching kids, and really everybody could use some, adults and kids and youth and teenagers could also use some education around this point, that it's okay to talk about suicide. It's okay to tell someone you're having these thoughts. It's okay and of course needed to reach out. But it's also okay to talk to someone who may be feeling suicidal, and ask them these questions. So many people fear that if I ask some person or a friend or family member, "Hey, are you okay? Are you having any thoughts about harming yourself?" So many people believe that that will lead to the increased chance of self-harm. Whereas in
Yeah.
fact, the research doesn't support that at all. A lot of the research supports the opposite of that, that asking someone about suicide shows support and may actually make the person less likely to make an attempt. So I'm really glad that you guys have added that into your program, and especially with the current
No,
reports of rise of suicide in not just teens but kids across the country, which is just staggering. You guys are making a great impact. Thank you
and
for that.
that ties into the social media lesson, social media safety lessons as well.
Yeah.
Um, you talked about opening up conversations. One of our focuses on employing our decision-making model is how do you do it without feeling that you're endangering your relationships.
Hmm.
For students, elementary school students, the relationships are so important to them. And sometimes the relationship overshadows decision making.
Yeah, that's
So,
for sure. You touched on social media, Frank, and like I mentioned before multiple times now, I got two little kids, and they don't really care about social media right now. They're still too young. But there's a war coming in my house when they get a little older and they start asking about. Because I'm not going to let them. I'm going to do
yeah,
everything I can to keep them off social media, at least until they're preferably 18. But I'll fight it as long as I can, because there's just nothing out there showing any kind of benefit of kids being all
um,
over social media, Instagram, Facebook, all that stuff. The research is all just showing it leads to further depression, anxiety, thoughts of suicide, and on top of all that, more likely, when you're suffering from mental illness like that, you're more likely to start experimenting with drugs and alcohol. So,
yeah. And you start being drawn to people that um, aren't going to help you.
exactly.
And the incidence of the availability of drugs online and through social media platforms is staggering.
That's a whole other conversation. How you can
Yeah,
just get it these days. I mean, even alcohol and marijuana here in California, there's an app for that now. You can just type the app and it can be delivered right to your house. I mean, we're,
yeah.
again, kind of feels like we're facing an uphill battle. Just a few more questions for you, Frank. I appreciate your time here. What advice do you have for parents, educators, community leaders who want to prevent substance use among our youth, if you had to summarize it?
Again, developing a comprehensive community strategy. Um, the parents that are working for the city and the Department of Engineering should be given educational support relative to their children and substance use. It just shouldn't be the student in the classroom.
Yeah.
The operators of the local mall should be involved in messaging that supports the well-being of students. Um, as I said, a lot of times leaders will think, well, we have a program in place, so that's all we need. It really needs to be a long-term, multifaceted. Every time a student it changes environment, that they know the adults around them care.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely. I've been a big proponent about preventative medicine, so to speak, whenever I get a chance. Because again, in my world of treating substance use disorders, patients come to my facilities at their absolute worst. They don't start coming to inpatient treatment when they just started smoking a little marijuana. They really want to, nip that in the bud, so to speak, and stop. They're coming to us when they've had overdose or near death experiences, or they've been drinking for 35 years and their doctors are telling them they're going to die. Or that's the kind of patients that we're seeing. It's the preventative piece is long gone. Now we're just dealing with the current problem. But I've been a big proponent about prevention and preventative medicine for many years. So again, I thank you for what
But the
you're doing.
people that you deal with at that point, they need the resources. They need to be helped.
Exactly.
There's a lot of productive lives, I believe, are wasted because the resources, particularly in underserved communities, aren't there for treatment and recovery.
One thing I'll say to our listeners who are out there now, may have younger kids or teenagers now in the home, maybe you're worried about them starting to experiment with drugs and alcohol, or maybe you're worried that they've already begun that. One thing I really stress to parents out there is to make sure everything in your medicine cabinet is locked up. I mean, if there's any narcotics or benzodiazepines or anything sitting around, I don't care if it's 2 or 3 years old, some prescription you got from a dentist, that medication needs to be disposed of properly or locked in a box or a safe. I've told people, it sounds a little dramatic, but having a bottle of oxycodone in your bathroom medicine cabinet is just as dangerous as having a loaded handgun sitting on the kitchen counter. There's no real difference. It's just as dangerous to family members. So that is something you can do as a parent. But what I would really like to get the message out to, and I think Frank would agree, is if you have any suspicion that your child may be using drugs or alcohol, you find something in their room, they're acting differently, erratic behavior changes, if you don't know what to do or how to help, seek support. Seek support through programs like D.A.R.E. Seek support through therapists or online communities or whatever you need to do to help prepare for that conversation with your child. Because again, it's about preventing the problem before it happens. Lastly, go ahead.
Kind of a follow-up to that. I think parents really need to listen to what their children are saying.
Yeah.
Sometimes the child won't come out and say, I have a problem. But in their conversation, they'll drop hints.
Mm-hmm.
And the parents be attuned and alert to those, that it's not just noise. It could be a call for help.
Yeah.
And you have to recognize it.
Agreed. As a parent myself and a psychologist, I try to remember that a lot with my children. Instead of, kind of just telling them what they need to do, which is my immediate urge, I'll be honest, most of the time, I try to just sit there and listen to what they're saying, like you said, and reflect back to them what they're saying to show them that I'm listening and I understand, or if I need clarification. Not always easy as a parent. We're all busy. We're all short-tempered sometimes. But I think you're right. You hit it right on the nose, Frank. It's important that we listen to our kids, because there might come to a point where they're just not going to talk to us anymore about anything at all, especially if we don't develop those habits early in life. I think lastly, what future initiatives or plans does D.A.R.E. America have in place to further its mission, preventing substance use among youth? What are some of the things you guys are working on in the horizon?
So currently, we're implementing what we call D.A.R.E. University.
Oh, interesting.
This is to help D.A.R.E. instructors refine their skills for classroom presentations. That's the first effort. But eventually, we hope it will serve as a platform for adults and professions that require continuing education and are looking for educational components to deal with substance abuse prevention. We're working with the Kingdom of Bahrain right now on lessons that deal with peaceful coexistence at middle school and avoidance of affiliation with anti-terrorist ideologies in high school. The link between D.A.R.E. and terrorism and narco-terrorism. A lot of money that goes into narcotics lands up supporting terrorist activities. So that's a unique endeavor. We're involved with the Ministry of Education and Interior in Bahrain, several educational institutions in the United States, and we're on entering the third and final phase of evaluation of all the students in Bahrain involved in that curriculum.
That's amazing. Frank, thank you so much for being on the show today. Is there any, what if people who are listening or watching, what if they want to get involved? How can they help?
So our program is essentially involved law enforcement officers in the schools. There are a lot of parental organizations out there that I would encourage people to participate in. If your community doesn't have a D.A.R.E. program, I would encourage parents to talk to their school administrators or law enforcement decision makers to convince them that there's a cost, but it's an investment.
Excellent. Anything else that you wanted to say, Frank? Did we miss anything?
I appreciate your efforts, your reach to your audience. I don't think people can be advised too often that there's people that need help and how they might be able to help.
Agreed. And again, as a clinical psychologist specializing in substance use disorders, I've devoted my entire career to helping people get through this, to help them get to the other side, to lead better and healthier and more productive lives. But I am just in awe of people like you who have given a career of service to help prevent these problems from happening in the first place. We're even though we've never met before today, we're a team, right? There's a whole team of us all across the country working together. You're working on the kids and the youth on that side to prevent them from ending up in facilities such as mine when they become adults. And I'm really grateful to you and your organization and everything that you guys do. Thank you, Frank Pegueros, for taking the time to speak on BeWell today. Your work with D.A.R.E. is educating and saving lives every day. To our audience, if you or a loved one is struggling, contact BeWell Recovery. There is help for today's life obstacles. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ted Bender.